Where lesson one focused on building the basic mechanics and understanding of how to use your arm to draw specific marks with intent, and also the basics of perspective, lesson two is a lot more about exploring 3D space and how to construct forms within 3D space so that they feel consistent with each other. We did tackle a little bit more of that at the end of the last lesson, and I do hope that you've tackled the 250 box challenge before starting this one, especially if you had any difficulty with the rotated boxes or organic perspective boxes exercises. So the first exercise here is called the arrows exercise. And in premise, it's quite simple. You just draw a bunch of arrows. So it's kind of like drawing flowing ribbons through space. And then you give it a little arrowhead. And there you have it, an arrow. But there's a little bit more to it. First of all, there are some definite challenges that people tend to experience. It can be quite tricky to... The first curve that you draw is pretty straightforward. You just kind of do a winding S. But people get confused as to how they want to tackle the next one. So people will somehow try to sometimes stay on one side of the original curve, which results in this kind of weirdness where your ribbon really has no way of flowing consistently without flattening out and getting kind of weird. Other people have a lot of difficulty just matching a curve to draw the first one, especially if they're used to drawing from their wrists. So if I were to try and draw a matching curve with my wrist, it's going to be a lot trickier because it's going to be very stiff. So it becomes very important that you draw from the shoulder. And of course, you guys are probably still getting used to that. So except that you might have some, difficulties with that, but it's still going to give you a much better, more flowing line if you're doing it correctly. So while you're drawing this curve, all you really have to do is try and mimic this first curve exactly. Like I could just take this one and I could just copy it and bring it down, and it would be perfectly what I wanted. So all you're looking to do is create an identical clone. Don't be afraid of running over the original curve. And here you just draw lines to kind of bridge the gaps between them. And then here you add your arrowhead. Now, there is one other aspect of this exercise that is worth discussing, and that is the fact that a lot of people, when doing this exercise, will get caught up in thinking, or at least limiting their thinking to the page or canvas that they're drawing on. So what that means is the page or canvas is only two-dimensional. There's limited depth in the scene. So if I were to draw this, you'll notice that you could, in many ways, picture this as kind of just flowing within a fairly, limited space. Really just the primary movement is in the two dimensions of the canvas. There's a little bit of play in depth. Like you can tell that this is probably a little bit further away and this might be a little bit closer. But for the most part, it's just in the space of this canvas. So instead, what I want you to do is I want you to think about one side of the arrow being closer to the viewer and the other side being much farther away. So if we were to draw our regular curve, the sort of swooping motion around the back, which is here where it's going to be further, they're somewhat tighter and then they open up a little bit more as they go through. And also, I want to just tweak my second curve a little bit so that the width of my ribbon is much smaller as it's further away, and then it gradually gets larger. And this, of course, is a little bit trickier, so you can focus on this once you've mastered the first kind of direct cloning. That's a little bit wobbly, but you still get the idea. And so you can tell that this ribbon is moving from much farther away from you to much closer. And the reason that this is very helpful is that as you draw more in a way that actually occupies the full extent of all 3 dimensions, you kind of train your brain to realize that this piece of paper is no longer just the limitations of where you can draw. I've said this before a few times in previous videos, but basically the page is just a window into a larger infinite expanse of 3-dimensional space. So if you are getting used to the idea of putting things much farther away and then bringing them closer to you, then you are training your brain to think in terms of, okay, this is a 3-dimensional space. I'm not just drawing on a piece of paper. I'm constructing things inside of this alternate world. And so that comes in very handy as we move forwards, because a lot of our later constructional drawings have a lot more to do with your belief in the illusion of space that you're creating. Because the first step is to make sure that you yourself are convinced that the forms that you're drawing are in fact 3-dimensional and not just shapes on a page. The other thing is that in the next lesson, lesson 3, these arrows share a lot of properties with the leaves that we'll be exploring, because they're essentially flat shapes that float in 3 dimensions. So we're technically still drawing a 3D object, but the object itself only has 2 dimensions of kind of variance. It's got a width and a height, or a width and a length, but it doesn't have any actual thickness to it, but it still exists in 3D. So I will leave this exercise here. Hopefully that clarified some aspects of it, and hopefully it helps you execute it with more success. Of course, if you have trouble with it, that's totally normal. Just keep pushing forwards, make sure you get critique, and have people kind of identify the specific problems that you might be encountering.